Nancy Pelosi's biggest mistake after nearly 40 years in public life was not a comment, a headline, or a document. It was walking into that Senate chamber believing she could handle the moment the way she had handled every other moment in Washington.
Most of the Democrats don't. You know who was not standing up and cheering? Nancy Pelosi.
For decades, she had survived everything. She had outlasted threats, public fury, internal rebellions, brutal election cycles, and opponents who spent years trying to turn her into a symbol of everything they disliked about the political class. She had learned the central lesson of survival in modern politics. Never let an attack stay an attack. Reframe it, absorb it, outlast it, and make the other side pay for trying. That instinct had carried her a very long way. It helped her through the stock trading controversy when it first exploded into public view. In late 2021, she defended the idea that members of Congress could participate in the market in a free market economy. Weeks later, under pressure, she shifted and sounded more open to restrictions. Later still, when pressed on national television about the issue and the optics around her family's wealth, she gave the kind of answer that sounded less like a rebuttal than a brush-off. Look at your own self. That was classic Pelosi, in one sense, sharp, dismissive, unwilling to grant moral authority to the critic. But it also hinted at something else. The old answers were starting to look tired. So when she entered that chamber on a Tuesday morning in March, she was stepping into a setting she understood better than almost anyone alive. The room was orderly, focused, and already charged. Reporters were in place early. Staffers moved with the alert stiffness that shows up when everybody knows the cameras may catch something memorable. The hearing had the formal language of procedure, but nobody in the room mistook it for routine. Josh Hawley's legislation had been branded for maximum attention, and Pelosi knew perfectly well that her presence was part of the spectacle. She arrived as she always had, controlled, elegant, self-possessed. At 85, she still carried herself like someone who had commanded rooms for so long that command had become instinctive. Her staff moved around her with professional ease. Democratic senators greeted her with the restrained solidarity of people who wanted to project unity without drama. J.D. Vance, already seated, had arranged his materials with almost fussy precision. A legal pad, 2 pens, 4 folders. It was a small detail, but in politics, small details are often warnings. Pelosi asked to make an opening statement, and when she stood, the room shifted toward her the way rooms always had. She spoke not merely as a witness, but as a figure defending a lifetime of power. She talked about 38 years of service, difficult votes, major legislative fights, the Affordable Care Act, the CHIPS Act, the defense of democratic institutions, the work of leadership under pressure. She framed her career as a record of hard-won public service, not private accumulation. Then she turned directly to the matter hanging over the hearing. She said she did not trade stocks herself, had no prior knowledge of her husband Paul Pelosi's transactions, and knew of no finding of wrongdoing. Paul Pelosi, she reminded the room, was a private citizen and a businessman long before she entered Congress. It was a polished defense, and not an unserious one. She also made a shrewd political point. Her name had been attached to the bill because her name generated headlines. Other lawmakers in both parties had faced questions about trading, but her visibility made her the most useful symbol. That argument had logic behind it. In Washington, branding is often policy's louder twin. Pelosi understood that as well as anyone. Then Vance began asking questions, and the danger for Pelosi was that he did not approach her the way her enemies usually did. He did not roar. He did not grandstand. He did not try to corner her with theatrical accusations. He chose something much more effective. calm, document-based doubt. He started with public financial disclosures and the basic contrast between a congressional salary and the scale of the Pelosi family fortune. He acknowledged investment returns, outside income, and the lawful reality that members of Congress are not expected to live on salary alone. But he asked the question that mattered politically, even if it settled nothing legally. What are ordinary people supposed to think when they look at those numbers? That was the beginning of the shift. Because the issue was never just legality, it was trust. It was optics. It was whether voters who work regular jobs and struggle to get ahead look at Washington and see public servants or a closed club that keeps getting richer while explaining why everyone else should be less suspicious. Pelosi answered with the point she had made before. Her husband had been financially successful long before her rise to power. That may well be true, but truth alone does not always solve a political problem when the public has started measuring your life against its own. Vance then moved to her own changing public statements on stock trading, laying out the contrast between her earlier defense of congressional trading and her later support for restrictions. Again, he did not claim that changing one's position is itself evidence of wrongdoing. Politicians change positions all the time. But he presented the sequence in a way that invited viewers to see adaptation not as wisdom, but as pressure management. That distinction matters. In Washington, a changed position can look like growth to allies and calculation to skeptics. He pressed further on the legislative question. If Pelosi and her party understood the public concern, why had Congress not acted more decisively on stock trading reform when she held the gavel? Why had a bill with bipartisan appeal and strong public support never become a priority? Pelosi answered with the familiar truth that legislative agendas are crowded and complicated. That, too, may be fair. But it did not erase the larger impression that Congress somehow always finds time for the things it urgently wants, and often runs out of time for the things that would clean up its own image. Then came the most politically delicate part of the exchange. Vance walked through a series of publicly reported trades and the timing of later government actions affecting major companies. He was careful not to state criminal conclusions. In fact, his restraint was the point. He acknowledged that strong investment performance can come from market judgment, experience, and luck. But he asked how public confidence is supposed to process repeated patterns in which political power, regulatory action, and market outcomes seem to orbit the same small class of people. Pelosi responded as she had before. Everything was disclosed, no position was abused, no confidential information had been used for personal gain. That answer addressed the legal issue. It did not fully address the emotional one. Because the public question was not, at least not entirely, can you prove wrongdoing? It was, why does this keep looking like a system designed by insiders for insiders? That is a much harder question, because it can survive every formal defense. It feeds on plausibility, not proof. And once that kind of doubt hardens, even a correct answer can sound incomplete. Then Vance stripped the scene down even more. He set aside the folders and asked the simplest question of the day. If everything about the system was acceptable, if the conduct was lawful, if the disclosures were complete, then why had Nancy Pelosi's name become the most recognizable shorthand for the problem? Why had her name, of all names, become attached in the public mind to the need for reform? That was the moment. Not loud, not explosive, just a direct question with no easy exit. Pelosi answered first by saying her name had been politicized, weaponized for visibility. That was not a foolish response. It was probably partly true. But Vance kept returning to the substance. Why does the law need to exist? Why does the public connect your name to this issue? Why is the symbol so sticky if the underlying problem is only invented by opponents? And then came the silence. A few seconds, nothing more. But politics has a long history of being altered by moments far shorter than speeches. The silence mattered not because it proved anything, and not because it amounted to some cinematic confession. It mattered because millions of people could project their own judgment into it. Some saw unfair targeting. Some saw a veteran politician finally running out of evasive language. Some saw a woman being blamed for a culture broader than any one lawmaker. Others saw the rare public moment when a powerful figure seemed unable to give an answer that matched the scale of the doubt around her. That is why the hearing stayed alive after the cameras shut off. Not because Vance established a legal case. He did not. Not because Pelosi collapsed. She did not. She remained composed, answered later questions cleanly, and left the room the same way she entered it. Upright, disciplined, visibly in command of herself. But the frame had changed. The burden of explanation now sat with her. And once that happens in politics, the damage can be subtle but deep. What followed was not immediate collapse. Pelosi still had loyal donors, loyal allies, and a record large enough to prevent simple caricature. Her supporters could point correctly to major legislative achievements and years of disciplined leadership. But the conversation had shifted from what she accomplished to what she represented. That is a brutal change for any politician. Achievements belong to history. Symbols belong to the present. And the present is usually less forgiving. Among Democrats, the reaction was cautious but revealing. Few wanted to denounce her outright. She was too important, too historic, too embedded in the party's identity. But more voices began talking about restoring trust, strengthening transparency, and meeting the public where it is. In Washington, that kind of language is rarely random. It is how politicians create space between themselves and a figure they still respect, but no longer want to stand too close to. That was the real danger for Pelosi, not Republican attacks. She had been surviving those for decades. The danger was disappointment inside the broader middle, including among people who had once defended her without hesitation. Disappointment is harder to fight than hatred, because it sounds less partisan and feels more personal. A voter may tolerate ideological warfare. A voter is less patient with the sense that the people running the country live by one set of assumptions while everyone else lives by another. In that sense, the hearing did not destroy Pelosi. It did something more lasting. It ended the idea that her old methods of survival still worked automatically. For decades, she had been one of the best in Washington at making other people play defense. In that chamber, for a few quiet seconds, she was the one absorbing the question with nowhere clean to send it back. There was no dramatic verdict, no official finding, no neat conclusion. Just a shift. And in politics, shifts are often what matter most. Once the public starts asking whether a leader's legacy includes not only power, but also the very problem reformers are trying to solve, no amount of resume can fully put that question back to sleep. What made the aftermath more dangerous than the hearing itself was that nothing about it could be contained inside the usual partisan script. If a Republican senator had exploded, if somebody had pounded the table, if the room had turned into the kind of theatrical mess cable producers dream about, Pelosi's allies would have known exactly how to respond. They had run that play 100 times. They would have called it a stunt, called it disrespect, called it another cheap attempt to turn a complicated issue into a made-for-camera ambush. Washington understands how to metabolize spectacle. What it struggles with is restraint. Restraint leaves more room for interpretation, and interpretation is where political damage grows. That was why the clip kept traveling. People who had no intention of watching a full Senate hearing watched those few seconds anyway. People who normally avoided congressional procedure the way normal people avoid root canals suddenly had an opinion. Not because they had mastered ethics law overnight, and not because they had become experts in financial disclosure forms, but because the exchange felt legible. It translated the whole issue into a question that lived far outside Washington. If the public keeps seeing the same pattern, how long can the people inside the pattern keep insisting the pattern means nothing? For Pelosi, that was a uniquely difficult kind of pressure because it struck at the center of the identity she had spent decades building. She had never presented herself as a charismatic outsider or a social media performer or some anti-establishment crusader who wandered into Washington by accident. Her brand was competence, discipline, vote-counting precision, the steel underneath the silk. She was the grown-up in the room, the one who understood power not as performance, but as arithmetic. That image had protected her for years. It made even her critics grudgingly admit she knew how the game worked better than most of the people denouncing her. But competence can become a trap when the public starts associating it with a system they no longer trust. The line between "she knows how Washington works" and "she has become too comfortable inside the machinery" is thinner than most politicians want to admit. For a long time, Pelosi had stayed on the safer side of that line because her effectiveness delivered real outcomes her party could point to. The problem now was that outcomes were no longer the only standard. Voters were increasingly judging the whole class of political leadership through a different lens, one shaped less by legislative achievements and more by suspicion of insulation, privilege, and a style of public life that seems to age into wealth while lecturing everyone else about sacrifice. That is why her defenders, despite all their experience, struggled to find a response that actually landed. The first instinct was legal. Everything was disclosed. No finding of wrongdoing existed. No charges, no official determination, no formal conclusion. All of that mattered. All of it was real. But the more often those defenses were repeated, the more the public heard something else underneath them. Yes, maybe the rules were followed. But are the rules themselves the problem? And once a controversy slides from "did she break the rules" to "do ordinary people believe the rules are enough," the terrain changes completely. A legal defense is built to answer prosecutors, investigators, committees, and reporters. A trust problem is built out of emotion, mood, accumulated resentment, and the quiet humiliation ordinary people feel when they compare their own lives to the lives of the people who govern them. A legal defense says there is no proof. A trust problem replies that proof is not the point. That is not entirely fair, but politics has never been a game designed to reward fairness. It rewards instinct. It rewards symbol. It rewards the answer that sounds emotionally true, even when it is less technically precise. Pelosi knew that better than almost anyone, which is what made the whole thing so striking. She had spent a career using symbols to shape public arguments. She understood the value of a frame, the power of a phrase, the way one memorable contrast can carry more force than 10 pages of explanation. And now, she was living inside a frame she did not control. Her name was no longer just a name. It had become a vessel people poured frustration into. Fairly or unfairly, wisely or not, that was the reality. And reality in politics is often just repetition with better lighting. Within Democratic circles, the tension deepened because nobody wanted to be the first person to state the obvious too bluntly. Senior members understood that Pelosi's record was too large to dismiss and her network too extensive to casually alienate. Younger members understood something else. Defending her too aggressively made them sound like custodians of an old order the electorate no longer found charming. So they looked for the familiar middle ground that politicians reach for when conviction and fear arrive in the room together. They started speaking in abstractions: institutional trust, modernized ethics, transparency for a new era, reassurance to the public. Washington's most elegant evasions usually arrive dressed as principle, but even evasions reveal something. The more Democrats talked about reform in those generic terms, the clearer it became that the political center of gravity had shifted. What had once been a niche complaint or an opposition talking point was now becoming a respectable mainstream concern. That does not happen overnight. It happens when insiders begin speaking differently because they can feel the electorate changing temperature. No one says the old ice is cracking. They just start walking more carefully. In Pelosi's own orbit, there was still confidence that time might blunt the edge of the story. Time had saved her before. Time had a way of turning intense scrutiny into background noise, especially when the news cycle moved on to war, recession fears, primaries, Supreme Court decisions, or the next national outrage. Her team had lived through enough storms to believe that this one, too, might eventually be absorbed by larger events. That belief was not irrational. Washington is a city built on the constant replacement of scandal by fresh distraction. The trouble was that this story attached itself to something more durable than a single headline. It attached itself to a feeling voters already had. A feeling that the people in charge always seem to know where the exits are. A feeling that both parties can discover moral urgency when it hurts the other side, but somehow grow philosophical when reform might inconvenience their own members. A feeling that public life has become one long seminar in accountability for everyone except the people writing the syllabus. Those feelings had been fermenting for years. The hearing didn't invent them. It just gave them a focal point. That is why even voters who still respected Pelosi started speaking about her in a different register. They did not sound furious. They sounded tired. Tired of explanations. Tired of process. Tired of being told that what looked bad only looked bad because they did not understand the complexities. The American voter can tolerate a surprising amount of hypocrisy when they feel represented. What they do not tolerate well is the suspicion that the people representing them have become too fluent in a language ordinary life no longer speaks. And Pelosi, for all her gifts, had begun to sound like a speaker of that language. There was also a generational element to the reaction that mattered more than many commentators first realized. Older Democrats who had lived through the legislative wars of the Bush and Trump years tended to see Pelosi through the lens of battle-tested leadership. To them, she was the woman who could hold a caucus together, land votes under impossible conditions, and stare down presidents who underestimated her. Younger voters, by contrast, were less emotionally attached to her record and far more attuned to the broad anti-insider mood saturating American politics. They had grown up in an environment where distrust was the default setting, where institutional authority no longer received automatic deference, and where one viral clip could outweigh 1,000 committee accomplishments no one had time to read about. That generational split mattered because it exposed a larger problem for the Democratic Party. Pelosi was not just an individual politician under scrutiny. She represented a governing style, a leadership class, a whole era of Democratic power that had been built on procedural mastery and elite coordination. That style had delivered results. It had also accumulated the visual language of establishment permanence, donor networks, familiar surnames, polished messaging, old alliances, expensive neighborhoods, and an almost instinctive confidence that if the paperwork is in order, the broader moral problem can be managed. Younger voters were not always persuaded by that. Frankly, a lot of them seemed allergic to it. For Republicans, the temptation was obvious: turn Pelosi into the emblem of everything voters disliked about Washington and never let go. Some did exactly that, in tones ranging from sharp to ridiculous. But the more effective critics were the ones who didn't sound eager. They sounded disappointed, even weary, as if the issue was not Pelosi personally, but a capital city that had talked itself into thinking appearances no longer count. That style of criticism was more dangerous because it let viewers believe they were arriving at the conclusion themselves. Nobody likes to feel manipulated. Everyone enjoys feeling perceptive. Vance understood that dynamic and benefited from it. He did not need to act triumphant. In fact, triumph would have weakened the moment by making it seem too partisan, too personal, too obviously staged for his own benefit. Better to act as if he had merely voiced a question many people already carried. Better to sound like a translator of public frustration rather than its inventor. Whether one admired that tactic or found it irritating, it was politically smart. He stayed just measured enough that his critics had trouble painting him as hysterical. And in politics, the calmer person in the clip often wins the replay war. Still, none of this meant Pelosi's career collapsed into disgrace. That kind of cartoon ending belongs in low-budget political fiction, not in real public life. She remained too accomplished, too historically significant, too interwoven with her party's achievements for that. Democratic elites still respected her. Donors still answered her calls. Members still remembered what she had done for them. Influence in Washington does not vanish like a stage prop after one bad day. It erodes unevenly. It softens around the edges. It becomes more conditional. People still take your call, but they no longer assume being next to you is cost-free. That was the deeper change. Pelosi did not lose relevance overnight. She lost something subtler and maybe more painful: the aura that had long made even internal dissent feel risky. For years, many Democrats treated her not just as a leader, but as a force of political weather. You did not casually challenge Nancy Pelosi. You adjusted to her. You navigated around her. You waited until she had decided what the room would be. After the hearing, that instinct weakened. Not dramatically, not in public, but enough that members began imagining a future in which disagreement with Pelosi no longer felt like stepping in front of traffic. In Washington, those imagination shifts are everything. Politics is built as much on anticipated power as on actual votes. The moment people begin believing that a figure can be questioned, contradicted, or outgrown without immediate punishment, the whole structure around that figure changes. It does not matter if the person still has money, staff, relationships, and prestige. Those are real assets, but politics runs on atmosphere too. Pelosi had spent decades controlling the atmosphere. Now, for the first time in a long time, she was breathing somebody else's. The final irony was almost too perfect. Pelosi had survived by refusing to be reduced. She had endured because she was always more formidable, more strategic, and more durable than the caricatures built by her enemies. Yet this controversy reduced her anyway, not because she lacked answers on every issue, but because one issue started swallowing the rest. That is the cruelty of long careers in public life. You can spend decades building a record and still find yourself judged through a single frame. One phrase, one clip, one silence. One question that arrives at the wrong time in the wrong room and refuses to leave. And the question refused to leave because it touched a raw nerve far beyond Pelosi herself. Americans were not only watching her, they were watching their own suspicion take shape. They were watching a ruling class be asked, in effect, whether it still understood how strange it looked from the outside. Some viewers thought Pelosi had been unfairly singled out. Some thought she was merely paying the price for a wider culture Congress had tolerated too long. Some believed the whole thing was partisan theater, wrapped in the costume of reform. Others thought that even theater can reveal something real when the script lands too close to the truth people already feel in their bones. That is why the hearing lingered, not as a decisive verdict and not as proof of some neat moral lesson, but as a hinge. Before it, Pelosi could still be seen primarily as the woman who outlasted every attack. After it, she was also the woman who had to explain what her name now meant to people outside the chamber. That is a much harder position to occupy. Survival is easier when the fight is about your enemies. It is harder when the fight is about whether the public has started seeing you as part of the problem you once insisted only existed in the attacks against you. And in a way, that is the most American part of the whole episode. Not the ideology, not the party warfare, not the fundraising emails, or the media choreography, or the endless commentary pretending to settle questions it could only inflate. The most American part was the collision between success and suspicion. This country admires wealth and resents it, reveres power and distrusts it, celebrates mastery and immediately starts wondering what mastery cost. Pelosi had spent a lifetime proving she knew how to win. In the end, the problem was that too many people looked at that same mastery and began asking a darker question. Win for whom exactly? And at what point does the art of surviving Washington start to look too much like the art of becoming Washington? That question did not end her, but it changed the way the country looked at her. And once a country changes the way it looks at you, the rest is usually just timing.